Well, staying with this now, carbonated soft drink makers in Nigeria are set to face, according to reports now we have, a downturn in fortune by 2023 if the federal government forges ahead with its plans to introduce an ad valorem or percentage tax of 20% on fizzy drinks products. For some players in the industry, the tax bite could affect big companies. We could go naming the Nigerian Bottling Company, Coca-Cola, 7-Up, Wright's Food, makers of Biggie Drinks, and even Nestle Nigeria, causing severe downward pressure on sales of about 16%. Now, the proposed tax follows an earlier flat rate charge of 10 naira per litre of drinks produced, as the tax impact has unsettled operators with profit margins, of course, plummeting. Well, let's talk about this, understand what is happening in the manufacturing sector and what this new tax means for the sector. I'm being joined via Zoom by the founder of our ProShare Nigeria, Mr. Olufemi Awoyemi. Thank you so much. It's really an honor to have you join us on the program today.
Thank you very much.
I'd like us to start with an overview of the situation of Nigeria's manufacturing industry, or let's stay with the carbonated drink sector, who are already grappling with a 10 naira flat rate, and now there's a planned 20% a new value tax on their drinks. What does this spell for that industry?
Well, thank you. You started by saying what was the situation. So it's important that we understand the trajectory of the Nigerian economy before the 2020 pandemic and the trajectory post the global event. We were already facing some difficult headwinds on our own. And by the time those things happened, there was a serious effect, which also affected the Nigerian economy. The cold hard facts means that we must decouple those two things to understand the implication on the supply chain management effect on our manufacturing industry. So if we take a look at the Manufacturer CEO's Confidence Index for Q4 2021, released by MAN itself, it showed the industry had recorded a marked recovery from COVID-19. However, it was consistently identified growing economic headwinds for manufacturers, i.e., insecurity, foreign exchange challenges, high cost of locally imported raw materials, a deficit in skilled manpower, high technology adoption costs, a number of inconsistent government policies and overregulation. So if you take a look at the Manufacturers' Confidence Index over the year, you will see that there is a problem already brewing in the industry. But how did government react? Over the years, government has reacted in different forms. But you ask the question, why did the government want to do this? The answer is simple. Nigeria has a revenue challenge, and it needs to address it. And the most efficient way to address this is to take a look at the taxes. So obviously, government, supported by IMF and World Bank, have been looking at ways to address this problem. And this has culminated in a number of position papers and a number of submissions, leading up to the most recent position by the IMF, asking that certain sectors of the economy, taxation had to be improved upon. Now, if it has to be improved upon, there were also 4 other criteria that the IMF spoke about. And this is where we talk about fiscal policy management issues and challenges. So if you take one side and leave the other side, you're going to create a conundrum. So that means the whole intentions you set up for yourself will be defeated. And that's where we are right now. And this whole idea that we wanted to do an ad valorem tax, which on principle, makes sense for the government to do. I support it. But there's a single factor narrative here at play. Makes no sense. That means ad valorem requires that you understand your economic recovery curve. You also understand that it's a function of productivity. In the absence of both, and the fact that consumer purchasing power is dropping, you are going to be in a conundrum so that the increase in taxation you envisage will not happen.
It's a good way to start the discussion, Mr. Awoyemi. Interesting one. But now going to, you've talked about government needing revenue. But these same manufacturers are contending with, of course, high inflation. I identified that. Forex scarcity, high energy costs. So if this happens, direct impact, what will this mean for jobs, for the sector, for return on investment?
So if I get your question correctly, you're asking that if government is trying to solve its own problem and also in fulfilling its mandate as a government to raise taxes and create revenue for it to fund its program, decides to do this on it, what would they affect? There are 3 categories of people that this would affect. It would affect government, it would affect companies, and it would affect citizens themselves. How do I position this? The component of taxation ad valorem excise tax on its own should not be looked in isolation. Don't forget that this was an industry. When we passed the Finance Act, we included a 10 naira per production, for which incredible amounts of money have been paid in terms of excise duties already. So you are taxing production while you are also taxing consumption at the same time. So you are taxing this particular sector, which produces about 33% of your manufacturing sector. In terms of its capacity and ability to produce, that's where you find your situation. Now, if I take a pause and say, how will this affect this entity? Let's take it from the ultimate person that it will affect, which is citizens. It will affect them at two levels. One, there's going to be relative readjustments by the company, which will lead to job layoffs. And most importantly, a drop in the living standards of those who fall into the lower income household. Interestingly, today, a report just came out from Kingsley Moghalu's think tank, which spoke about the level of poverty in the country, which means that people at that base level have a social connection with the carbonated drinks industry, i.e., birthdays, functions, ceremonies, including, in fact, wedding list. You are asked to bring some bottles of soft drinks and whatever you have. Now, this would affect them in many ways that it will create alienation in some, and for some others, it will be deprivation. The second one is that the relative affordability of carbonated drinks means that the local brewing industry, on the other hand, like something like Zobo and others, may naturally go. That's what government would expect, but that is not going to be the case. Because these other drinks are not subjected to factory codes. So what government is doing is, on one hand, the formal sector, which you can tax, which you can levy things for, you are frustrating them enough to push them to the untaxable area of the informal sector, which then means that we're actually playing the classical Cobra effect. Second aspect, for companies themselves, the excise tax duty would obviously, and I mean this with all sincerity, translate to an increase in the unit cost of goods. Don't forget that for some who took on the 10 naira per whatever, they tried to pass a 5% increase. And every one of us should know that that 5% increase did not solve the problem, because for most of them, the data available to us at Pusher suggests that about 25% in value loss was achieved. So which means that there will be a fall in the demand for the goods, which will also induce further operational resizing. But the most important one is that for certain of those companies, they would have to suspend their capital project plans, which will affect FDI, will also affect the ability for them to get money to reinvest, to deal with technological changes, which they have to make in manufacturing to achieve efficiency, to cope with the first 10 naira they have had. From the government position, there are two major impacts. One, it will have to be about fiscal policy issues. The second will be about national productivity. Introducing excise duties is not even a problem. The ad valorem tax, however, can be done in a way that recognizes the rate of economic recovery. So that means you are actually taxing in relation to the ability to be more efficient. So here we have a conundrum. On the one hand, the government needs to increase taxes, and where they go for in most countries is where you call the sin taxes. I mean, i.e. drinks, cigarettes, tobacco, all those other things which people can necessarily, at a point, create a marginal value where they can say they can do without. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that these organizations are keeping the social balance in place, which then leads to the question that one of the gaps in public policy is that we have brilliant ideas to increase revenue of the government, but the social impact assessment of it, which will raise issues like timing, the rate at which you increase, or the flow at which you do so, is no longer there. So we end up with a militarized mindset whereby just say, government is box. This is it, this is it. There's no conversation and there's nothing there. So we're in a conundrum right now. And for every one of us, it's important that we understand the conversation around this particular ad valorem tax.
Interesting one. I'm also worried that when IMF comes up with policies or suggestions like this, Nigeria quickly want to take hold of it and go ahead and implement. But I want to ask you, what alternative do we have to sorting out this revenue challenge? What other alternatives can we look at this time?
So with the specific issues you mentioned, IMF is not entirely inaccurate in their position.
Okay.
Maybe what they must have done was that they may have overgeneralized their assumptions in terms of the social impact. Maybe they must have considered that this is an inelastic sector whereby nothing happens. For example, we joke in Nigeria that when we are sad, we drink. When we are happy, we drink. When we don't have anything to do, we drink. We just party. But I think they are over-assuming because in the last 5 to a decade, the trends have been adjusting relative to consumer purchasing power, which we've seen. And nothing has been much worse than what has happened between 2020 to date. So that's on one side. But there is also the principle about the ad valorem tax. The ad valorem tax principle measures increases with a productivity baseline. That is the whole essence of ad valorem. Without establishing a productivity baseline, which emphasizes economic recovery curves to know when things are improving, so you can adjust your tax in a progressive manner to take care of productivity, which then addresses consumer purchasing power issues and overall productivity issues. Truth is that if these things are not done, we have a problem. Yet, I honestly believe there are difficult choices ahead for the nation. And like one of my colleagues once said, eating hot pepper soup requires patience. And so does fiscal policy. So when you ask what are their alternatives, there are a few less hazardous alternatives for us. There are a few things I've spoken about concerning internalization of revenues hijacked by non-state actors, for example, if the government's focus is on revenue. Secondly, it will be about financializing government assets, which government is already considering and looking up. But the means at which they approach it, they also face the same problem we're addressing now. The third would be about, say, establishing market values for public assets by listing them on asset trading, just like what Saudi Arabia's Aramco did. Or to go to look at the Indian example, is to list public assets available for investment on a national register. But that would require us to resolve the public-private partnership conundrum we face. But specifically on this issue with this sector, the more easier ones for us to look at would be for us to take into consideration a way in which we can find a middle road, i.e., maybe government considers raising taxes by a modest percentage, not up to 5%, which will therefore will be an adjusted rate relative to their own price increase as well. So that means they would not have suffered any losses, but they would not have gained any benefit. But at least they would have been seen as a sector contributing to the economy. And they will have a leeway over a period of time to adjust this thing. And that's where conversation comes in. There's one hand to raise a policy, but the more important thing is for us to have that conversation with the decision makers and the industry. They can have those conversations. And it is important that we do so. Because from our model, this would not be a very smart idea for us if we follow through.
Not a very smart one. Indeed, and also reading through that report, I see that this will increase the stock of finished goods in warehouses.
Exactly.
Because, rates and all. But what would the companies do? I'm also thinking, would there not be sharp practices here now to cut costs, cut corners when everything seems to be on the high side and tax is coming up everywhere? What would the companies do? Where do they stand in all of this?
So here's the reality of a developing economy or an emerging market. But specifically, here's the reality of Nigeria. Every one of us must understand that the federal government has a large debt. There's a limit to which it can borrow. It can create bonds at the local level, whatever, there's a limit. And there are some conversations that need to be had at the level of the public policy and sovereign governance of Nigeria that we've been kicking down the can. And it's not even a subject of the current debate for the new election. There's a serious problem. So the government has a large role. Every stakeholder, including the organized private sector, we have a role to contribute to how to build the revenue of the federal government. And I believe that there's no other industry that's more responsible than manufacturers, who themselves understand that they play a role. You saw what happened during the COVID crisis, where the supply chain disruption affected everybody, and we went towards protectionism. Now, if we don't have a manufacturing base and we just put ourselves to importing, we're going to collapse. So government also recognized that he has to keep his manufacturing base at a more efficient level, and maybe some of them may benefit from this conversation to improve their efficiency. But generally, we have to change and help government increase revenue. What I believe the larger conversation is that how does government move from the point where it is and stop making the argument that Nigeria is paying less than other countries? But they should look at the other indices in those other countries when they are judging what it is, because the citizen will tell you that there's a moral question about what's the value of tax. So if we move away from the moral question and we're dealing with a corporate entity, every one of these corporate entities, and you mentioned a few names of those in the subsector, I believe they are responsible enough to understand that an engagement with government would mean that at some point, this is some conversation that will be had. How they go about it, how they avoid a single factor narrative from the federal government, just insisting and giving military orders to say, you pay the following tax, matters, because governments in the short term may force them to pay this revenue. But in the long term, government will suffer on multiple fronts. One, productivity will suffer, so the revenue will decline. Secondly, there will be other areas of where people produce products and you drive them into the underground, and then you cannot capture the revenue, which makes it even worse. The third most important thing is that you find a failing productivity and capital flight. In the one area, those who want to invest cannot invest because you can move from the 10% to 20%. What stops you from moving to a 30% tomorrow? Which therefore means that it will impact lower foreign direct investment. The job losses will be natural because companies will right size in order to keep themselves viable. But at some time, the ability for them to replace machinery and whatever means there's an issue. The final issue around this thing is that for a sector that is representing 38% of the whole total manufacturing sector, which is responsible for 30% of the GDP of the country, that is not a sector you toy with decision without having what you call an impact assessment, analysis, and conclusion, whereby you just adjust what you want to do. It is not about what you need to do, which I believe every one of us would agree. Anybody who loves this country will agree that is important. But it is unintelligent and actually sparks of ignorance of how markets work for you to suggest that an introduction of tax of such nature will make any difference in terms of your revenue drive. In fact, you may be shooting yourself in the foot.
Let's wrap up on this note. What is the outlook? It looks bleak, not looking too good. We're also moving into an election year where everyone is moving away to politicking and not much of governance ongoing everywhere. What is your outlook for the entire space? Manufacturing space, I mean.
Well, for those who are in the business of deciding on outlooks, that's a very interesting area for which they should be well paid. Because I'm sure that for anyone who understands the number of factors that are creating a headwind in Nigeria, the outlook for the country in 2023 is one of measured optimism, if there ever is any. Because of the global headwinds that you see happening in terms of recession across the globe, and our ability or inability to have buffers to provide absorbers for this shock waves that will come. From an internal perspective, there are just a myriad of issues that we need to deal with. Having said that, however, trained analysts learn to look at the opportunities that this occurs. In generations, you find that this cycle repeats itself. And so a thinking of a government working through the public-private sector arrangement that has been going on, and one must give credit to government in that regard, is that we can therefore understand where it will work. However, the major challenge is that it can work for a few the way we have done it up till now, but it doesn't work for the generality of everybody. And if you cannot make sure that the average person is able to have disposable income, your growth is also stunted by that. So the outlook for us is measured. Little enthusiasm on my part in terms of what changes we expect. But I think it's just a measured enthusiasm because we've passed this road before. And I'm fairly a bit older now. So I'm more measured in what I say concerning the economy. I'll leave the analysts who are good at it to conclude, and then we can then offer opinion for some. In summary, therefore, and specifically to this subject, I am passionately concerned that we do have very highly intelligent men in the government. who are knowledgeable about economy, finance, markets, taxation, and how it works together. It is therefore my plea that the responsible thing for us to do is to sit down and work with the industry through some numbers, and then we can then find a way to build up. And not just this industry, every other industry, because productivity is low. People are even thinking of shutting down, and stuff is happening. And you can see all this. Everyone overseas is preparing for a recession. If there's a global recession, where are we planning for the upside? Now we are now challenging our businesses itself. We are facing a very dire consequence in that. And so in summary, government is right to consider revenue increases through taxation. The ad valorem tax, if expanded fully well, it's also a good concept. But when you do it, how you do it, how much you do it, are the issues that are not resolved. And with that absolute lack of clarity, a lot of things can go southwards. So as it is today, without clarity from how government wants to do so, or an engagement whereby not only just the subsector understanding, but those who are in charge of commenting on the economy also understanding, it is not a very, it is not a decision that suggests that wisdom is at play here.
Mm. Well, it's a good way to leave it there. I've been speaking to founder of Approaching Nigeria, Mr. Olufemi Awoyemi. Thank you so much for making sense of this and making us understand this better. Do enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you very much.